We got one from Until Next Week. Go follow.
Vietnam is in an enviable position.
One of the world's fastest growing economies.
Samsung and popular shoe brands like Nike and Adidas have been relocating their manufacturing operations from China to other countries, such as Vietnam.
Big question is, can Vietnam make China back off?
Strategic location. On paper, it looks perfect. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. If Vietnam is the obvious replacement, why hasn't it already replaced China? Because this isn't just about labor costs. It's about scale, and scale is where the illusion breaks. Most people think China won because it was cheap. That's the headline version. Cheap labor, cheap factories, cheap exports. But that explanation is outdated. China didn't dominate global manufacturing because wages were low. It dominated because it built something no modern country had ever built before. An entire industrial civilization in one connected system. Not just factories, but massive steel production feeding construction and machinery. Rare earth mining and processing for electronics and EVs. Fully integrated battery supply chains from raw material to finished cell. The largest port infrastructure network on Earth. High-speed rail moving goods and workers across industrial regions. Dense clusters of component suppliers. Advanced machine tooling ecosystems. Industrial robotics manufacturing. Logistics software networks. State-backed export financing. Engineering universities producing millions of technical graduates. And most importantly, all of it connected. You don't just build an iPhone in China. You build it inside a megacity, where the screen factory is 20 minutes away. The chip packaging plant is down the highway. The camera module supplier is next door. The tooling specialist can redesign a mold overnight. The packaging facility runs 24/7, and 50 subcontractors can pivot within hours if a spec changes. That density is the real advantage. Because when you compress an entire value chain into one geography, you eliminate friction. No cross-border delays, no customs bottlenecks, no multi-country coordination failures, no fragile handoffs between disconnected suppliers. If a part fails, you fix it locally. If demand spikes, you scale locally. If a design changes, thousands of engineers respond immediately. China didn't offer low wages, it offered industrial gravity. Everything pulled inward. Factories attracted suppliers. Suppliers attracted logistics. Logistics attracted infrastructure. Infrastructure attracted capital. And once that flywheel spins at national scale, it becomes self-reinforcing. That's what people miss. China wasn't a cheap factory. It was a complete ecosystem. And replacing a factory is easy. Replacing an ecosystem, that's something entirely different. And that's where the Vietnam narrative starts to break. After COVID, tariffs, and rising geopolitical tension, companies realized something terrifying. Relying on one country for everything is risky. Supply chain shocks, lockdowns, sanctions, trade wars. Investors began repeating a phrase, China plus one, meaning keep China, but add a backup. Vietnam became the obvious candidate. Why? Wages lower than China, political stability, strong export orientation, trade deals with US and EU, coastal access, aggressive foreign investment incentives. By 2023, Vietnam's exports exploded. Electronics, textiles, furniture, consumer goods. Apple suppliers expanded. Samsung invested billions. Intel built facilities. It looked like the beginning of a shift. But here's the part people miss. Vietnam isn't replacing China. It's attaching itself to China. And that's a very different thing. Vietnam is very good at final assembly. But assembly is the last mile of manufacturing. It's the visible part. The part where screws are tightened, screens are snapped in, boxes are sealed. And that final step often represents less than 10% of the total value chain. So let's ask the uncomfortable question. Where does the rest come from? Where do the precision components come from? China. Where do the industrial machine tools that build those components come from? China. Where do the rare earth magnets, battery materials, and advanced chemicals come from? China. Where do the intermediate parts, circuit boards, connectors, casings, sub-assemblies get sourced? Mostly China. Even when a product says made in Vietnam, what it often means is assembled in Vietnam. The chips may have been fabricated in Taiwan, the battery cells refined in China, the glass processed in China, the tooling designed in China. Vietnam handles the final integration, but integration without supply depth is fragile. And here's where it gets serious. Vietnam does not yet have large-scale domestic steel ecosystems, advanced semiconductor fabrication plants, deep petrochemical processing, battery cathode and anode refinement at scale, heavy industrial robotics manufacturing, mass precision tooling clusters. China has all of it. And not just in isolated factories, in clusters. Industrial zones where suppliers sit next to manufacturers. Logistics hubs connect directly to ports. Subcontractors respond within hours. That's vertical integration, and vertical integration is power. Because if a shipment gets delayed, a Chinese factory can source locally. If a machine breaks, a Chinese supplier can repair it overnight. If a design changes, thousands of engineers can pivot quickly. Vietnam doesn't have that depth yet. So here's the real question. If China paused exports tomorrow, how long would Vietnam's factories continue operating? Weeks? Days? Maybe hours? That's not replacement. That's dependency, just geographically shifted. And dependency is not resilience. Let's look at scale, because the scale is where the illusion collapses. China's population, 1.4 billion. Vietnam's population, around 100 million. That's not a small difference. That's 14 times the labor pool. China's manufacturing output exceeds $4 trillion annually. Vietnam's output is growing fast, but it's a fraction of that. Now, think about ports. China operates 7 of the 10 busiest container ports in the world. Shanghai alone moves more containers than most countries combined. Vietnam's ports are expanding, yes, but they are not built for planetary throughput. China can absorb entire industries. Electric vehicles, scaled. Solar panels, scaled. Battery production, scaled. Steel, scaled. Vietnam cannot absorb that magnitude of relocation. There isn't enough industrial land, heavy transport infrastructure, skilled labor depth, grid stability, energy redundancy. And energy, this is the part most analysts gloss over, is the silent constraint. Factories don't run on optimism. They run on megawatts. China generates enormous energy capacity from coal, hydro, nuclear, wind, solar. It built excess capacity on purpose. Vietnam's grid is expanding rapidly, but it is under strain. Blackouts have already occurred during peak demand seasons, and heavy industry doesn't tolerate unstable power. You can't assemble high-precision electronics if voltage fluctuates. You can't run industrial robotics if power reliability is inconsistent. And building grid infrastructure isn't quick. It requires mass capital, long permitting cycles, transmission networks, fuel logistics, political coordination, which takes years, sometimes decades. So when people say Vietnam will replace China, what they're really saying is Vietnam will scale 14 times its industrial base, energy capacity, port throughput, and supplier depth rapidly. That's not impossible, but it's not happening overnight. And that's the gap between headlines and reality. The original China model was labor arbitrage. Cheap workers means low-cost exports. But modern manufacturing is less about cheap labor. It's about automation, precision, and logistics. Foxconn factories don't look like sweatshops. They look like controlled engineering environments. China invested for decades in technical education, engineering programs, manufacturing research, automation development. Vietnam is catching up, but it's decades behind in technical depth. You can move a sewing operation quickly. You cannot move a semiconductor ecosystem quickly. That requires tooling expertise, supplier networks, research clusters, deep capital markets, and time. Lots of time. This is where the narrative really breaks. People assume China is losing, but China isn't collapsing, it's upgrading. Low-end manufacturing is moving out. High-value manufacturing is moving up. China now dominates electric vehicle batteries, solar panel production, rare earth processing, high-speed rail equipment, advanced robotics, industrial drones. While Vietnam assembles consumer electronics, China builds the machines that build the electronics. That's a different level of control, and it's harder to displace. Vietnam has one major constraint China doesn't: geographic vulnerability. China is massive. Vietnam is narrow. It shares a border with China. Its economy is deeply intertwined with it. Vietnam cannot fully decouple from China without destabilizing itself. So, its strategy isn't replace, it's balance. That means attract Western investment, maintain Chinese trade, avoid provoking either side. That tightrope limits how aggressively Vietnam can scale as a geopolitical substitute. China built its manufacturing dominance with state-owned banks, industrial policy, massive infrastructure spending, export subsidies, long-term planning. Vietnam is pro-business, but it doesn't command capital at China's level. Replacing China would require trillions in infrastructure, mass industrial relocation, energy expansion, massive education investment. That's not a 5-year project. That's a generational project. So what are we really saying? Not replacement, fragmentation. Instead of one China, we're getting China, Vietnam, India, Mexico, Indonesia. But none of them individually equal China. Not a substitution strategy, and diversification increases cost, which means goods get more expensive. Supply chains get more complex. Margins get tighter. The era of ultra-cheap globalization may be ending, not because Vietnam failed, but because China was uniquely efficient. China's dominance wasn't an accident. It was engineered over 40 years. Scale compounds. Infrastructure compounds. Industrial knowledge compounds. Vietnam is growing fast. It will become extremely important. But replacing China? That assumes manufacturing is plug and play. It isn't. It's ecosystem driven, and ecosystems take decades to build. The world wants a backup, but it doesn't want to pay for one, because replacing China would mean higher prices, lower margins, slower scaling, massive capital spending, and that cost hasn't fully hit yet. So the next time you see a headline saying, Vietnam is the next China, ask a different question. Is Vietnam replacing China, or is China still quietly powering Vietnam? Because those are not the same story. And here's the twist. Vietnam might not replace China, but India is trying something very different. And if that strategy works, it could reshape global manufacturing again. That's where we're going next. Thanks for watching, and I think you would also like this next video.
All right, guys, go follow. Woo.